Last time we went through chapter 6 together, and that is where we saw the famous event of Daniel and the lion's den. You remember that the first 4 chapters of this book took place during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar as king over the Babylonian Empire. Chapter 5 was when Babylon's last king, Belshazzar, was defeated and also killed by the Medo-Persian army, who became the new superpower, with Darius the Mede taking over as king in Babylon. Chapter 6 then took place sometime after that, still during the reign of Darius, as Daniel had been retained as part of the leadership structure in the new Medo-Persian Empire. And so chapter 6 told us that Daniel had actually been appointed as one of the 3 main governors who oversaw 120 satraps, who were like district managers over the empire of the Medes and the Persians as a whole. And it did not surprise us to see that Daniel excelled over all of his peers, standing out so much, in fact, that Darius considered putting Daniel over the affairs of the entire Medo-Persian realm. But Daniel's peers would have none of that, and so they tried to sniff around and investigate and sniff around some more and find some area of Daniel's job performance first that was faulty, so that at the least Daniel would not be promoted over them, and maybe even further, depending on what they could find, maybe he would even be disqualified from service at all. But Daniel was so faithful, so diligent, so God-honoring, that they could find nothing whatsoever about his job performance that they could accuse him of. And so we saw that they expanded their investigation into his entire life, professional and personal. And they still found no error or fault in him. So faithful and so blameless was his conduct and his behavior and his attitude. So consistent was his public and private life, and without any hypocrisy. But like we said last week, they knew that everything Daniel did or did not do was rooted in his relationship with God. And so if it is because of God that Daniel has such integrity and character, then that must end up being the target for them. If there were wrong things that Daniel would never do because of God, then there would also be right things Daniel would always do for the very same reason, because of God. And so God became their target. We know their fairly slick strategy. They convinced Darius rather easily, actually, that for 30 days nobody in the kingdom could petition or could ask for help from, pray to any god or man, except for King Darius, under penalty of being thrown into the lion's den. Of course, Darius agreed, thought that was great. And it, of course, did not take long for those schemers to catch Daniel breaking that new law. Because what did Daniel do except what he had done customarily in his life? Regularly and consistently, every day, Daniel went home and he prayed, open window toward Jerusalem 3 times a day, praying to God. Rushing to Darius, of course, the accusers reported Daniel's violation. Darius realized his error immediately, but he could not undo the law. And so reluctantly, he had Daniel thrown into the lion's den. Remarkably, Darius had great faith in Daniel's God, saying to him, your God whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. And so after a night that was far worse for Darius than it was for Daniel, the king rushed to the den, called out for Daniel, who of course was alive and fine. He answered him, telling him that God had sent his angel to keep him safe. And the chapter ended telling us the 2 ways in which Darius then responded. First, he had those who had accused Daniel thrown into the lion's den themselves and their families with them. Second, he sent out a royal proclamation that all people should fear Daniel's God, because Daniel's God is an alive God. Daniel's God is a powerful God. Daniel's God reigns forever, Darius said. And with that, we have seen Almighty God make himself powerfully evident to the pagan kings of both the Babylonian and Medo-Persian empires through God's faithfulness and through the faithfulness of God's servants. God used his servants in difficult circumstances. They endured, they persevered, they were faithful, and they sacrificed in the face of great trial, particularly as it relates to Daniel's life. And God used those instances to make his glory known. That is certainly the theme of the first half of this book. The sovereign, powerful, eternal reign of God over all the earth, demonstrated in the historical events of the first 6 chapters. Chapter 7, though, opens now the second half of this book, which changes gears a bit. God's sovereign rule is still the theme. God doing what he wants in the earth is still the theme. God being the king and establishing his forever kingdom eventually is still the theme, the main theme. But we do change gears a bit now for the second half of the book. It is still historical, of course, as it revolves around Daniel in particular still. But instead of recording events related to kings and kingdoms in real time like before, we now have the records of the prophetic visions that the Lord showed Daniel personally. Just as the events of the first 6 chapters spanned many years and many kings, so also does the timeline on which Daniel's visions came to him also span many years and many kings. The opening verses of the next few chapters indicate that for us. However, these visions pertain to kings and kingdoms, that much is clear, but they are grand in scope, covering all of human history leading up to the coming of the Son of Man, setting up his eternal kingdom on earth. And if that whole picture of kingdoms of men that lead up to and precede the coming of the kingdom of the Son of Man, if that reminded you of Nebuchadnezzar's first dream about the great statue that Daniel interpreted back in chapter 2, then that is a good thing, because there is direct correlation. In front of us now are the expanded revelations of that basic dream of the kingdoms of men that precede Messiah's kingdom. The basic dream came in chapter 2, expanded revelations on the same topics, kingdoms of men and then the kingdom of Messiah. That is now what chapter 7 is about, and chapter 8 too, for that matter. We'll talk more about the parallels between chapter 2 and Daniel's visions now as we move along in chapter 7. So let's begin. Chapter 7, verse 1 of the book of Daniel. Yeah, chapter 1. All the way through to chapter 7 tonight. Okay. Chapter 7, verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head while on his bed. And then he wrote down the dream, telling the main facts. Nebuchadnezzar, of course, had been the preeminent king of the Babylonian Empire. And there were a few less notable kings that followed him, none of whom reigned for very long in Babylon. And that left, as we know, Belshazzar as the final king of Babylon, as we already just reviewed. And so this now, the record of Daniel's visions that starts in chapter 7, now takes us back on the timeline a bit and fits in to some of those places now on that same timeline. On the historical parts of the first 6 chapters, we've come past Belshazzar into the times and the reign of Darius the Mede. But now with the visions, we now go back and we cover some of those areas. So this shows us that we're now, this first vision of Daniel, that it occurred during Belshazzar's first year as king over Babylon. And that, of course, gives us a timestamp in real history once again. It's important that we have these kinds of things in such a prophetic book. Critics of the book of Daniel and of its remarkable predictive prophecies have tried to disconnect the prophecies from their fulfillments that took place later on. And they do so by trying to claim that the book of Daniel was written far after Daniel's life, with the obvious hindsight that's 2020 of relating events that already happened, but then claiming that they wrote it beforehand. And that is what some critics of the book actually do. They obviously refuse the supernatural foretelling of future events. They reject the inspiration for such miraculous words as being God himself, the forever one, the self-existent one, the one who is the Alpha and the Omega, the one who is the beginning and the end. So yes, it is God who describes himself that way in the Scriptures, ascribing to himself without apology that very unique ability to foretell future events with accuracy and then to see them be fulfilled. Putting God's very signature, if you will, on the Scriptures, on the Bible, among all other books, as this one being divinely inspired rather than mere human ideas and writings cobbled together to make it look like they predicted things ahead of time. Like I said, a person could obviously do such a treacherous thing, knowing what happened in their own past or in the past before them, and then write it and then claim that it's old. People could do that. The manuscript evidence removes any of those kinds of criticisms from the Bible. In Isaiah 41, the Lord, speaking through the prophet, openly mocks the futility of idols, specifically because they have no power to lay out accurate prediction of things to come. That's a specific characteristic that God says, those things can't do this thing that I can do. God there in Isaiah 41 says, present your case. Bring forth your strong reasons, says the King of Jacob. Let them bring forth and show us what will happen. Let them show the former things what they were, that we may consider them and know the latter end of them. Or declare to us things to come. Show us the things that are to come hereafter, that we may know that you are gods. Yes, do good or do evil, that we may be dismayed and see it together. Indeed, you are nothing, and your work is nothing. He who chooses you is an abomination. In Isaiah 44, it says, thus says the Lord, the King of Israel, and his Redeemer, the Lord of hosts. I am the first and I am the last. Besides me there is no God. And who can proclaim as I do? Then let him declare it and set it in order for me, since I appointed the ancient people. And the things that are coming and shall come, let them show these to them. Do not fear nor be afraid. Have I not told you from that time and declared it? You are my witnesses. Is there a God besides me? Indeed, there is no other rock. I know not one. Probably the most famous of these kinds of claims from God is what we see in Isaiah 46. He says there, remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me. How so? Declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure. Calling a bird of prey from the east, the man who executes my counsel from a far country. Indeed, I have spoken it, I will bring it to pass, I have purposed it, I also will do it. Obviously, Isaiah himself was no stranger to recording divinely inspired predictive prophecies, some with incredible detail, naming people and places, the greatest of which, of course, have to do with Messiah's birth and death, Messiah's purpose, and Messiah's kingdom to come. There's much more we could say about all of that. But accurate and fulfilled prophecy is a major aspect of the Bible that elevates it as holy and disqualifies others as earthly at best, and at their origins satanic at worst, in their attempts to counterfeit and deceive and make themselves look like they came from God. Back to Daniel for his vision, his predictive prophecy given to him from God that he saw during the first year of Belshazzar's reign in Babylon. Okay, so as verse 1 says, here are the main parts of what he saw. Verse 2, Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and four great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. In ancient writings like these, the Great Sea often referred to the Mediterranean Sea, although it's possible that it referred more broadly to the ocean at large. Different commentators have said both. Nonetheless, that is this picture now. He's not talking about, Daniel's not thinking back of the Sea of Galilee or some small thing. He's thinking of the Great Sea now, this massive expanse of waters. And this is where what he sees now at the start. There are many parallels between Daniel's visions of end times and John's visions of end times that we have recorded in the book of the Revelation of Jesus Christ, and this is one of the main ones. The whole picture of beasts coming up from the sea is one of the most extraordinary parallels of them all, because we find remarkably similar images in Revelation 13 and 17, which also include, 17 does, some interpretation for us. So in Revelation 13:1 it says, "Then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name." So there at the beginning of that chapter, we see John sees this same kind of thing, a beast rising up, a hideous beast, rising up out of the sea. Revelation 17, that is where John saw the great harlot, referred to as Babylon the Great. Full of blasphemies she is, full of abominations, violence against the martyrs of Jesus, and that she is in that vision riding a scarlet beast. And in Revelation 17, the angel explains it to John, saying, "The waters which you saw, where the harlot sits, are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues." So that gives us some interpretive understanding of what the great waters or the great sea means, and beasts, a beast or beasts, coming up from it. Because that's where we are back here in Daniel. So, very similarly, we have beasts coming up from the sea, which has significance for us in a couple different ways. One is geographically, one, of course, with prophecy is symbolically. Geographically, the kingdoms, which these 4 beasts in Daniel 7 represent, which the parts of the statue in Daniel 2 represent. Geographically, the kingdoms referenced here in Daniel's vision, again, are the same as those that we saw in chapter 2. They all had, geographically speaking, the Mediterranean Sea as an important focal point of the vast areas that all 4 of those kingdoms ruled, especially as you get into the 3rd and 4th kingdoms, the 4th which leads into Antichrist and then the coming of Messiah. So that's increasingly important, is that location. We also take clear notice of how Israel is centrally located in relation to all of that, which is no accident, especially Israel in particular, related to the kingdom of Antichrist that Messiah comes and destroys. So it's geographically important, particularly with the Mediterranean Sea in mind. Obviously, though, it's also very symbolically meaningful. The angel in Revelation 17 said that the waters represent something. He interpreted it. It means peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. So the sea represents mankind as a whole, the heathen world at large, mankind on the earth. Hence the argument for the Great Sea being the ocean, perhaps, representing mankind more broadly than the Mediterranean Sea might. That's not surprising, probably, since these beasts are, in fact, kingdoms of men. It's also worth noting that these beasts or these kingdoms arise from a sea that is being stirred up. It said the sea was being stirred up. That's what Daniel noticed first about the sea. And then he saw 1, 2, 3, 4 beasts come out from it. In the original language here, the word here for stirred up, it means to strive upon or to break forth. And so, if the sea represents peoples, nations, tongues, if it represents the world at large, the heathen world at large, then with this picture now, we have the striving of men. Striving, and even says there, against the winds of heaven itself. Mankind striving against God. That results in these beasts or these great kingdoms arising among men. Mankind who, because of how we are made, longing for authority, knowing we should be worshiping something, longing for an order and a structure over our lives, recognizing that inherent, innate way that we are. But the refusal to embrace such a thing from the God who made us. That is the striving of mankind who would rather supply for himself a king and a kingdom. And although God sovereignly works out his will within the context of each and every one of those man-made kingdoms, they're still at their core man's replacement of God as king and ruler over them. That is why they would appear as beasts, because that is what they are compared to God's rule and God's kingdom. We can talk about that more in a little bit. Here are the beasts, though, rising up out of the stirred up sea. So here is Daniel's vision, verse 4 through verse 7. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it. And suddenly another beast, a second like a bear. It was raised up on one side and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said thus to it, Arise, devour much flesh. After this I looked, and there was another like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. We'll stop right there for a minute. We have now, obviously, these 4 very remarkable beasts. They obviously vary from one another, both in the symbolism used to describe them and in the timing. Right? Like we said, they are kingdoms of men that followed one another successively on the timeline of world history. Also, of course, like we said, we take the statue from Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2, and we can lay it right alongside these 4 beasts. And it's actually because of chapter 7 and chapter 8, as well as world history itself that we can look back on. That's what helped us interpret chapter 2 back when we looked at it, to be able to identify the 4 kingdoms. So let's look at the parallels now between these two. Like we said, chapter 2 is the basic part. Chapters 7 and 8 now are an expansion, an expanded revelation from God to the prophet Daniel of these kingdoms and the time to come, and of Messiah's kingdom that follows. So here are the parallels. First, in this, as far as the statue is concerned, we have the golden head of the statue, right? Daniel interpreted that as Nebuchadnezzar personally, but as the Babylonian Empire at large. Daniel said it was gold because it was the greatest of the empires in its majesty and in its glory compared to the world around it. There was nothing that matched the greatness, the magnificence of the Babylonian Empire in world history. It was the first world monarchy on the world stage, and so its greatness there under Nebuchadnezzar. Parallel, what do we see with the first beast here in chapter 7? It also has greatest type characteristics, except just represented in an animal world kind of way, right? It was a lion, or like a lion, he says. The lion is the king of the beasts. What in world history, as far back as you can go, the lion is recognized as the king of the jungle or the king of the beasts. So it is like a lion. It also has eagle's wings. What is the most majestic of all of the birds in the sky? It is the eagle, recognized as the king of the birds, or the king of the air. And so we have those two in each, on the land and in the air. We have the 2 animals that anybody would look at and recognize as the most regal, the king over all of those kinds of animals. But then it says something happens to this beast that has wings like an eagle. The wings were plucked off. Oftentimes when you have wings used as symbolism in Scripture, they represent the ability of something to go far and wide, the ability of something to move, or the area that it can cover. All right? So if this lion-like beast with eagle's wings, and the wings are then plucked off, that would tell us something about this kingdom, that there came a point in this kingdom where it couldn't expand any further. Its growth or expansion was stopped. It was ceased. It was arrested in some way. The wings plucked off. Its ability to rule far and wide was removed from it. Well, when did that happen? In particular and most famously, when Nebuchadnezzar, the greatest of the Babylonian kings, forfeited his sanity, right? In chapter 4. When in fact, he actually lived as a beast, remember? Even given the heart of a beast. He didn't just look like one and act like one, he thought like one. Then when he finally humbled himself and turned his eyes to heaven, it said, acknowledging God as God, God alone being great, then he was lifted up. Recall that? God opposes the proud, you know that. You know that he gives grace to the humble, or lifts up the humble. He exalts the humble. He lifts them up. James 4:10 tells us very simply, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he will what? He will lift you up. And that's what it says here in verse 4. The beast that's like a lion with eagle's wings, but the wings plucked off, the beast was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the man's heart was given to it. And that runs right in line with what we saw happen to Nebuchadnezzar himself personally, right? Nebuchadnezzar's physical state, even his heart and mind, was returned to him from having been turned too beastish to now being back like a man in appearance, in thoughts, in behavior, in his heart, and all that. His royal position as king over the kingdom was returned to him as well. And so the gold head of the statue and now this first beast represent the Babylonian Empire. Okay? Second, statue. The silver chest and arms. The chest and arms and the 2 arms on the statue made of silver. Remember that Daniel interpreted that as the kingdom that would obviously arise after Babylon, that would still be great, but would be inferior to Babylon. Daniel said that it would be inferior to Babylon, just as silver is great, but it is inferior to gold. So back to chapter 7 now, what about the second beast here? We see that it is also recognized for being, for its great strength, right? This beast looks like a bear. Bears are obviously known for great strength. They are still very strong and they are still very fierce, even destroying much flesh, it says there, at the end of verse 5. But a bear, while strong and fierce, is not the king of beasts like a lion is. So there's a step down for the next one. Remember that the statue part for this beast, for this kingdom, was a chest and 2 arms, right? So 2 arms. You compare that with this bear that's raised up on one side. It raises up one side of itself higher than the other side, almost as if it were to lift up its big weight, the leg, the arm, the shoulder, and be ready to take a step forward, which big old bears kind of bound around like that. So keeping that in mind, right? The statue part that represents this kingdom is the chest and 2 arms. The beast part that represents this kingdom is one side lifted up over the other side. So 2 arms, 2 sides of the bear noted. And then the contrast between the 2 sides, right? One side raised up. These facts correlate to the 2-sided kingdom, right? It wasn't just one people group that defeated and replaced Babylon on the world stage. It was 2 groups together. It was the Medes and the Persians. It was a combined people as one empire who defeated Babylon, and that's the picture here. These 2 people groups. But, as seen with the bear, one side raised up and the other not, that shows us that one side, and history confirms that one side became greater than the other. They didn't always stay in tandem and equally powerful. Eventually, the Persians superseded the Medes, and when the next kingdom comes, history tells us it's the Persian Empire that they defeat. So that's what we see here. Now, there is the added feature of this bear. He's got something in his mouth. He has 3 ribs in his mouth. Now, scholars have proposed a number of interpretations for what the 3 ribs represent. But the one that seems the most reasonable is that the ribs represent something notable about what the bear has devoured, right? It was actually, there were words spoken to the beast, that is the bear, right? Devour much flesh. And so then there's this picture of ribs in its mouth, and you would think that there's a connection there between the number 3 and the fact that it is devouring or did devour 3 things. So the most likely view is that the ribs that it's devouring, and the fact that there's 3, that it represents the most notable kingdoms of the world at that time that the Medo-Persians did conquer. That, of course, would be Babylon, but also the kingdom of Lydia to the west from there, and the kingdom of Egypt also to the west. And so that is what many hold as what the 3 ribs in the mouth of the bear actually mean, that it devoured not only Babylon, but also Lydia and Egypt in time to come, and had a further expanse of the land that it conquered. So there again now, a parallel. We have the statue's silver chest and arms, and the second beast here in chapter 7, again representing the Medo-Persian Empire. It is worth noting that Daniel's vision in the next chapter, chapter 8, includes the specific interpretive help of Gabriel the angel, interpreting Daniel's chapter 8 vision for him, and telling Daniel, the 2 main characters of Daniel's chapter 8 vision are a 2-horned ram and a male goat. Those are the 2 main characters of the vision in chapter 8. And Gabriel tells Daniel that the 2-horned ram in that vision is, noting its 2 horns, Gabriel tells him that is the kingdom of Media and Persia together. He tells him specifically who those people are. Now, remember that both of these visions, chapter 7 and chapter 8, they occurred in the 1st and in the 3rd years of Belshazzar's reign. Then, as you recall, it's at the end of his reign when he throws the big feast in chapter 5. He desecrates the temple vessels. God responds by sending a hand that writes on the wall and pronounces judgment upon him. So, putting all the timeline stuff together, we have Daniel, who already walked into Belshazzar's banquet hall in chapter 5. He walked into that banquet hall having already had the visions that are recorded in 7 and 8, but they happened before that. Okay? Chapter 7's vision in his first year, chapter 8's vision in his 3rd year, and in Belshazzar's last year, he throws the feast and has the writing on the wall. And Daniel walks into that banquet hall with those visions and that divine knowledge already understood, already interpreted for him. So then he sees what's on the wall and he is easily able to give the interpretation. Now, I don't know about you, but I think that's awesome. All right, 3rd. The statue. From chapter 2, the statue's belly and thighs of bronze. Remember, Daniel interpreted that as the kingdom that obviously would come after and replace the Medes and the Persians, or really the Persians, actually. So, like I said earlier, history tells us that that was the Greeks, but so does Gabriel in chapter 8. After saying that the 2-horned ram was Media and Persia, he says that the goat is Greece. Says it way before Greece is on anybody's mind. On anybody's mind as any kind of superpower. This is while the Medes and the Persians are the superpower and the brand new superpower. So why would you expect? This is still, in fact, it's actually even before they're the superpower. All right, let me get it straight. It's in Belshazzar's reign. So the Medes and the Persians might be on the horizon, right? Babylon might be hearing about this group off over there as an upstart. but certainly they're no threat. And Daniel, though, in the 3rd year of Belshazzar, is having this vision, and now not only is Media and Persia going to eventually grow and overtake Babylon, but way down the line from that, Greece is going to rise up and overtake the Persians. And Daniel has been given all of this stuff on the world stage to understand. So Gabriel explains that to him here. So that helps us understand, that helps us know why, even without the hindsight of world history, the vision of chapter 8 already identifies the 3rd kingdom. And that's going to be Greece. How does that respond to the beast here in chapter 7, this 3rd beast? Well, what is this 3rd beast? It says it's a leopard with 4 wings. Just as, obviously, bronze, right? The bronze belly and thighs. Just as bronze is impressive, but it is less so than silver and less so than gold, right? So also is a leopard. Impressive, but less so than a lion. Less so than the strength of a bear. Not as regal, not as royal, but what might a leopard be known for more so than certainly a bear and even a lion? Quick, swift, fast, right? So it's no accident that that's something that we have here. Because in addition to it being a leopard, there also is this leopard that has 4 wings. What did we already say about wings? Quickness, ability, being able to cover areas of ground far more quickly than even if you were when you were on the ground. So, most scholars look at the fact that it's a leopard and that it has 4 wings now. And 4 wings, oftentimes 4 is just used as an example of vastness and coverage. 4 corners of the earth, 4 spots on the compass, those kinds of things. And so they look at this, it has 4 wings, and that it would point to, and history would agree, the vast expanse of the Greek Empire. Far more ground on the face of the earth than the Babylonians or the Persians had. And so that's what the Greek Empire was known for, not just how far it stretched, which on the map, I'll flip it for you, Macedonia, Greece, down to northern Africa on the farthest west side, all the way through the Middle East, over to India and southern China on the east side. So it's a massive expanse of land. Far bigger than Babylon had, far bigger than Persia had, did the Greeks have under their control. Not only did they have far more under their control, but Alexander the Great is known for having done so with unprecedented quickness. Alexander the Great established that vast empire and that land of it at its height. It took him about 3 years of war to conquer the mighty Persian Empire, and approximately another 10, which at that time is really fast. He didn't have armored transports. He didn't have planes to put everybody in. He didn't have any of that stuff. Mostly a lot of feet. And he's able to cover that much land and conquer that much, not just travel that much land, but conquer it. So you have this vast expanse now, about 3 years to conquer the Persians in particular, and just become the new world power. But then another 10 years or so to go on and accumulate far more land than the Persians had under their control. And this was while he was, for the most part, that's a good 13 years or so, but most of those years is when he was in his 20s. So unprecedented in scale, unprecedented in quickness, even unprecedented for how old he was. And so you have a young man who was incredibly strategically smart, very, very ambitious, obviously, and so that's what he did. We also notice something else about the leopard, that it has 4 heads. Why? Again, history. And again, Daniel chapter 8 helps us. From Daniel 8, we see that the Greek kingdom was prophesied to break apart into 4 smaller kingdoms. You guessed it. Good job. History tells us that that's exactly what happened. Daniel 8 wrote about it ahead of time. History confirmed it later. After Alexander's time, the kingdom was split into 4 parts between 4 generals. So that's what we have with the Greek kingdom. The 3rd kingdom, the leopard with the wings, and the bronze belly and the bronze thighs, that's the Greek. And so then now we have the correlation between those. Fourth beast, 4th part of the statue. The statue's legs of iron and even we would include some of it in explaining it, the feet of iron and clay. What is the most significant feature of that, of course, right? Well, we have had a head of gold, a chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, and now the bottoms of the legs and the feet mainly being of iron. Iron, of course, is known for being tremendously strong. So that is now what is the trademark of this new, or this fourth empire, is its great strength. Strength like iron. Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2 that fourth empire, marked by the strength like iron, would crush, would shatter, would break in pieces all the others. History, of course, identifies that for us as the Roman Empire that overthrew the Greek one. The fourth beast then here is described similarly, right? Dreadful, terrible, exceedingly strong, teeth of iron, devouring, breaking in pieces, it says, trampling even the residue of its destruction. So it destroys and then retramples on the residue. That could be a picture of how long the Romans ruled, because they ruled for hundreds of years, far longer than the Babylonians ruled, or the Persians ruled, or even the Greeks ruled. The Romans ruled for far longer. So that could potentially be the meaning behind trampling on their residue, that it was able to rule over those in history for a long time. We have the vast strength and reach of the Roman Empire, far longer than the other three, especially in its time. Notable feature of this fourth beast is that Daniel saw that it had 10 horns. There at the end of verse 7, we know that horns prophetically signify leaders, signify rulers, people who have authority. So what about those? Look at verse 8. I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. So although this horn starts out little, visually unimpressive compared to the other rulers, at least at the first. So among a group of world leaders or authorities, one is going to set himself apart. 3 others are going to be defeated and replaced by him in some way or another, and he's known for speaking pompously, for speaking arrogant, prideful words. All right, look again at Daniel chapter 8, because this is further information basically on the same kind of thing, on end times in particular. In Daniel 8, look at verse 9. It says, and out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. And it grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground, and trampled them. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down, his meaning God's sanctuary. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth down to the ground. He did all this and prospered. As we'll see, he will only do so for a time. Similarly, look down at verse 23, and in the latter time, this is now Gabriel interpreting, in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall rise, having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. Keep that one in mind. He shall destroy fearfully, and shall prosper and thrive. He shall destroy the mighty, and also the holy people. Through his cunning he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule, and he shall exalt himself in his heart. He shall destroy many in their prosperity. He shall even rise against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without human means. All right? Now, keep it fresh and turn over to Revelation 12. We're going to do some more turning here tonight. All right, Revelation chapter 12. Listen to verses 1 through 4. Now a great sign appeared in heaven, John says, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. Then being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems on his heads. His tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. The dragon stood before the woman who's ready to give birth to devour her child as soon as it was born. So now again you have a dragon in this case. Now the dragon is the devil, but you have this dragon who, similarly to what Daniel saw, 10 horns, and then one comes out from it. All right, now over to Revelation 13 again. Look at verses 1 and 2. Then I stood on the sand of the sea. Remember that part? We talked about that earlier. And I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. Now the beast which I saw was like a, listen to this, like a leopard. His feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. The dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. What did Daniel 8 say? That this king to come, he shall destroy. He will be mighty, but not with his own power. So this beast, now that John sees coming up out of the sea, this beast that is the kind of the whole incorporation of what it of kingdoms of men, right? Like Daniel saw, lion, bear, and leopard. Those parts are all incorporated into what John sees in the beast that is the Antichrist himself. Again, with the 10 horns, does not have his own power, but instead we see is empowered by the dragon, the devil himself. That is what we see here. Look down at verse 5. And he, this beast, was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and he was given authority to continue for 42 months. Then he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven. So we have, as I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of correlations, a lot of parallels between what Daniel saw and what John was also shown. We have a lot of the symbolism that is the same. So now as we look back at this, related to and coming out of this fourth kingdom is this particular person standing out among all other world leaders and rulers during his time, who is marked by his initial appearing to not be so much, because he's just a little horn, but he's given a mouth, and with it, like John saw in Revelation, he speaks blasphemous, arrogant, pompous words, exalting himself, like Daniel 8 says, up even to the prince, or to be like the king. And don't we know that's what the devil is guilty of? He exalts himself, even saying, I will be like the Most High. Daniel's vision now back in Daniel chapter 7 continues. He's seen these 4 beasts now. Verse 9, I watched until thrones were put in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated. His garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was a fiery flame, its wheels a burning fire. A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. 1,000 thousands ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. And the court was seated, and the books were opened. That is obviously an extraordinary picture of the courtroom in God's presence, that God as judge over heaven and earth, and the majesty, the power, the fire, the throne, the glory, the praise that he's getting from thousands times 10,000s of the angels there in heaven and of the saints there in heaven, and all the praise that he's receiving. That is the picture of then, though, everyone takes their seats, and court is now in session, right? The books are opened, and now the judge is going to make his judgment. The Ancient of Days, of course, is Yahweh himself. This is God the Father, distinct from the Son, because the Son's going to show up in a few verses. So Daniel continues to watch in verse 11. I watched then because of, right? I wondered what was going to happen with this arrogant horn. I watched then because of the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking. Right? I wonder what was going to happen to this guy. I watched until the beast was slain, and its body destroyed and given to the burning flame. You can go into Revelation 20 and know that the devil himself and the Antichrist are thrown where? Into the lake of fire. Back here in verse 12, as for the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. Verse 13, I was watching in the night visions. So he sees the destruction of the Antichrist, obviously, of the fourth beast. I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man, coming in the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed. All right, Daniel chapter 2 again. We have the statue there. We have the iron and the clay, the bronze, the silver, the gold, all together. Because first Nebuchadnezzar saw, and then Daniel saw, that there was a stone, right? A stone not cut with hands. And it was thrown to the base of the statue, and it destroyed it. Daniel tells him, you watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay, and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, clay, bronze, silver, and gold were crushed together, and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found, and the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Forward from that chapter 2 into verse 44, it says, and in the days of these kings, Daniel interpreting, in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. So we see that all-consuming, all-encompassing, completely dominant, totally victorious, unrivaled, and with no end kingdom that comes after the kingdoms of this world, destroying them, and in particular this one that Daniel saw, this mouthy horn that he looked at. And the Ancient of Days gave authority to the Son of Man to go and to take care of that. And Revelation shows us that very thing in a couple different places. In Revelation 5 is where we see that a scroll was sealed, and it was asked by everybody in the presence of the Lord, who is worthy to open the scroll, to break the seals and open the scroll and read what it says, to take possession of it. And no one does at first, right? You remember John weeps because this is terrible. And then one like a lamb stood up, a lamb that had been slain. And there is the correlation from that to what we see here. The Son of Man comes to the Ancient of Days, and he is able, he is worthy to take the scroll, to loose its seals, and to then bring judgment on the earth. And that is exactly, of course, what Revelation 6 through 17, 18, 19 show us, that very thing. So now that's the vision itself, and we have worked on the interpretation, certainly. The kingdom forever that follows. Now look at verse 15. I, Daniel, in response to this, I was grieved in my spirit within my body, and the visions of my head troubled me. I came near to one of those who stood by and asked him the truth of all this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of these things. He said, those great beasts which are four kings which arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. And then he has a particular question, because remember, he took note of the horns on the fourth beast and then this particular one, right? So then I wished, verse 19, to know the truth about the fourth beast. In summary, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its nails of bronze, which devoured, broke in pieces, trampled the residue with its feet, and the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up, before which 3 fell, namely that horn which had eyes and a mouth which spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows. I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints and prevailing against them until the Ancient of Days came, and a judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom. So Daniel records this to the angel there, to the explainer of the vision, and he kind of summarizes the whole thing about what he has seen regarding the fourth beast, what he looks like, and the horn. So all of that and what he sees the horn able to do, which is have a time of conquering even over the saints of God. So he asked, and now here's the answer, verse 23. Thus he, the angel, said, The fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all other kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, trample it, and break it in pieces. The 10 horns are 10 kings who shall arise from this kingdom, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the first ones, and shall subdue 3 kings. So that fits with what we saw with the horns. He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. And then the saints will be given into his hand for a time and times and half a time. That's something that we have touched on many times before. We obviously touched on it before, even just this past Sunday when we were looking at the Olivet Discourse and how that goes back to referring to Daniel and forward to Revelation as well. So speaking of that era, Revelation 13 says the following, beginning in verse 7. It was granted to him, this is the little horn with an arrogant mouth, the Antichrist, it was granted to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And authority was given him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. And all who dwell on the earth will worship him, whose names have not been written in the book of the life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. If anyone has an ear to hear, let him hear. So we have that related to that same figure forward in Revelation 17, beginning in verse 6. Remember what the little horn is able to do for a time, right? Here again, I saw the woman drunk with this is the woman, the Babylon the Great, the harlot. I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I marveled with great amazement. Further down in verse 12, again regarding the saints, the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but they receive authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast. These are of one mind, and they will give their power and authority to the beast. These will make war with the Lamb. The Lamb will overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are called, chosen, and faithful. Although they be defeated or conquered or even crushed underfoot of the Antichrist for a time, but the King comes. The King is coming. And so even in those difficult times like we talked about on Sunday, those who are the people of God, called, chosen, and faithful, endure to the end without fear, knowing that though they kill the body, they cannot separate me from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus. Daniel seeing this grand scope of human history laid out before him with the kingdoms and then Messiah's kingdom to come, when judgment is brought against the kingdoms of men at large and the Antichrist in particular. So again, judgment in mind, verse 26, but the court shall be seated, they shall take away his dominion to consume and destroy it forever, his being the little horn. Then the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole earth shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. So that again takes us back to chapter 2, what Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar about what happens with the establishment of the kingdom of that stone, right? That it is a forever kingdom, it has no end, it totally destroys all the kingdoms of men, completely wipes them out, replaces them in full, and that it will not be like other kingdoms whatsoever. It's an everlasting one. All those inside serve and obey the king of that kingdom. And the chapter closes with Daniel kind of describing how he felt. This is the end of the account. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly troubled me, and my countenance changed, but I kept the matter in my heart. So there you have we have the close of that particular chapter. Daniel, being given this expanded and detailed and more broad, more information now about what he saw. And I just wanted to come back and point out what I mentioned briefly earlier. It's been asked by some, why even have a second vision if it's the same basic information? Well, first of all, there's expansion to it. There's more information to it. But I found it interesting that some of those scholars who kind of asked that kind of a simple question had a pretty neat answer. And I mentioned it earlier. When Nebuchadnezzar has the dream, who is a king, for him, when he saw it, and it's not because he interpreted it this way, this is how it was given to him. it looked glorious, right? The kingdoms of men looked glorious, a massive statue. And the kingdoms were represented by precious metals and valuable things, and things that on the earth are strong, right? Gold, silver, bronze, iron. So you look at that and go, yeah, the kingdoms of men, impressive and strong and mighty. When God shows his man, Daniel, the same kind of thing, the same lineup of history, 4 kingdoms to come, eventually conquered and replaced by Messiah's kingdom, it is not majestic. It is not glorious. It is not impressive. In fact, it's shown for how God sees it. And I liked that explanation. That's how God sees the kingdoms of men. Yes, they are strong in themselves. Yes, there's some swiftness, there's some agility, there's some impressiveness among men. But what are they really? They're beasts. They're hideous. They do great damage. They destroy the things that are around them. And so among men, sure, impressive. But God sees the greatest that man can accomplish, and the greatest among men even, the very kings among men. And they are hideous like animals. And the only thing in that whole lineup of Daniel's vision that he saw that wasn't like a beast was the one time when a king on the earth humbled himself before God, and God lifted him up and treated him like a man. That's an extraordinary picture that we have, so it is no wonder that we would have an expansion in Daniel chapter 7 with the visions of the kingdoms to come and the history to come after that. But I like that contrast, and that's good for us to remember in time to come. Men are setting up their kingdoms. There is still, we'll look at this more as our study in Daniel goes on. There is this revitalized 4th kingdom, right? And that, like I've said before, that's why many hold that that's a renewed Roman Empire in some way. So we'll talk about that more in time to come. But men are only going to continue to do what they've always done, apart from God. Set up some structure of leadership and clamor and try to climb and step over and get to the top and make themselves king and set themselves up a kingdom. Only to obviously ignore the living God who's already the king. He is the Ancient of Days, and he saw fit to speak to Daniel and give him these extraordinary images and visions for us to see and to take note of and to learn from. So let's pray. Father, we come to you and we thank you, the Ancient of Days, the one who is outside of time. You view time like we watch a TV show. And you see it all laid out, and you insert yourself actively in the affairs of mankind and actively into the events of mankind and even into the very decisions that people make along the timeline of history. And you've shown us these things that are to come. And I pray, God, that you'd help us to take note of these things and to take these things to heart, Lord, and to remember that you view the kingdoms of men as far from impressive. You are not impressed with kings because you already have one. And you're sending him soon to judge. There will be a day soon where that unrolling, that unsealing of the scroll is going to be read, and the things that we know in Revelation are coming will begin. Father, we pray that you would help your people, the called, the chosen, and the faithful, to be exactly that, Lord, faithful to the end. We get the theme of Daniel. You are God, sovereign over the affairs of man. We belong to you. We owe you everything. And it's our desire to be faithful to the end. Give us a heart like Daniel. Give us eyes like Daniel to see things the way you do. To be wholly unimpressed with the best man can offer. To be fully impressed by everything that you are and what you've done. We look forward to these things being played out. Help us to play our part well in Jesus' name. Amen.